They said Rome was dying, and they were not wrong. Streets that once echoed with triumphal marches now carried the heavier sound of anxious footsteps, merchants whispering about raids the way they once whispered about prices, senators watching the horizon as if the sky itself might announce the end. But history doesn't end with a drumbeat. Sometimes it turns on a single decision made in a dim room with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. In our world, the Roman Empire fractured, bled, and receded into memory. In this world, it does something far stranger and far more dangerous. It survives. The point where the story breaks is not a mythic moment with thunder and prophecy, but a practical one, the kind Rome was built on. In the mid-5th century, when the Western Empire is wobbling under civil intrigue, shrinking tax bases, and warlords who wear Roman titles like costumes, Emperor Majorian, young, capable, and doomed in our timeline, not only returns from campaign, but escapes the knife of betrayal, purges the court that feeds on weakness, and makes a choice that changes everything. He refuses to treat Africa as a distant province lost to fate, and instead commits the empire's remaining strength to the one thing that can buy Rome time: control of the sea lanes and the grain, the lifeblood that turns armies from hungry mobs into disciplined instruments. The campaign is brutal and expensive, and in the streets of Rome you hear it in the way people argue. The baker at dawn counts loaves like coins. A veteran in a worn cloak complains that the taxes feel like a second war, and yet the harbors begin to fill again. Not with rumors, but with ships. And with ships comes a truth the empire had almost forgotten. Logistics is power. When Africa is brought back under imperial administration, piecemeal, negotiated, fought over, then locked in with garrisons and governors who answer to law rather than to personal loyalty, the Western treasury steadies, and the steadier the treasury becomes, the less Rome needs to pretend that temporary arrangements are permanent solutions. The foederati, those federate groups settled inside imperial borders in exchange for military service, are no longer treated as necessary evils to be bribed, but as systems to be managed. The empire does what it always did at its best, and what it failed to do at its worst. It turns outsiders into stakeholders by making the rules clear, enforceable, and profitable. Land is surveyed again, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a hard instrument. Roles are updated. Corruption is punished not with speeches, but with confiscations that fund wages. And wages paid on time become a kind of magic that pulls loyalty out of fear. This is the first domino. Stable revenue means stable payroll. Stable payroll means fewer mutinies. Fewer mutinies mean fewer usurpers. Fewer usurpers mean fewer civil wars. And fewer civil wars mean the frontier can be defended by soldiers instead of by prayers. The next domino is political, and it is almost invisible at first. Majorian understands that the empire cannot be saved by pretending it is still the empire of old, so he stops trying to resurrect a past that no longer fits and instead makes a bargain with reality. He accelerates what had already begun, building a tighter administrative spine in the West, modeled on what the Eastern Court in Constantinople had refined. Professionalized tax collection, standardized military districts, and a reduction of aristocratic private armies by tying elite prestige to imperial service rather than to local dominance. Senators still wear silk, still speak in polished phrases, still dream of ancient dignity, but now dignity has a price tag. You want honor, you fund roads, you want influence, you equip a cohort, you want exemptions, you win them in court under rules that the emperor's agents can actually enforce. In taverns along the Via Flaminia, people begin to talk about the new discipline, the way sailors talk about a shifting wind, resentful, hopeful, wary. And because this is Rome, because this is an empire that learned to make ideology out of administration, the reforms are wrapped in language that feels like destiny, the restoration of order, the renewal of the world, the peace of the law. The Eastern Empire, still strong, still wealthy, still more urban than the West, watches this transformation with suspicion at first, because every surviving empire fears its own mirror. But the logic of survival forces a second divergence. Instead of drifting into separate fates, East and West tighten their bond, not through romantic unity, but through interdependence, because the East understands that a collapsing West will eventually drag the whole structure down through migration, contagion, and war. So Constantinople sends what it can spare: advisor, coin, ships, and the kind of bureaucratic expertise that keeps a state alive when heroes cannot. In exchange, the West agrees to a system that would have been unthinkable a century earlier: more coordinated succession planning, more formalized division of responsibilities, and a shared naval strategy that treats the Mediterranean not as a nostalgic lake of memories, but as a battlefield that must be owned. The Mediterranean stops being the empire's comfortable middle and becomes its armored heart. Pirate fleets are hunted down with relentless regularity, and the mere act of safe travel begins to change daily life. Merchants risk longer routes, news moves faster, distant crises become visible sooner, and visibility is a weapon. Another domino falls. With trade stabilizing, cities recover. With cities recovering, tax revenue grows. With tax revenue growing, infrastructure can be maintained. And with infrastructure maintained, the empire's greatest advantage returns: the ability to move men and supplies quickly across vast distances. The Roman road network, frayed and half-abandoned in our timeline, is not fully saved as if by miracle, but selectively reinforced like a muscle. Key arteries first, then secondary veins, then regional meshes. Each repair justified not by nostalgia but by cost-benefit calculations scribbled in the margins of official reports. In the countryside, where landlords once drifted toward private rule, imperial inspectors reappear like ghosts from an earlier age, counting, recording, threatening fines, offering deals, occasionally being ambushed, and then returning with troops. The message is unmistakable. The empire is not leaving. Over time, this changes the social architecture that, in our world, became feudalism. Local strongmen still exist because power always finds a shape, but their power is forced into a legal frame, and legality, even when imperfect, limits the fragmentation that turned Europe into a patchwork of competing lords. Latin remains not just a church language and not just a scholar's tool, but a living administrative standard across the West. And because language is the bloodstream of institutions, this single fact alters centuries. You do not get the same sharp break between ancient and medieval when the paperwork never stops. You do not get the same collapse of urban life when cities are still fed and defended. You do not get the same cultural forgetting when schoolmasters still teach rhetorical forms because government still demands them. In our world, monasteries became islands of literacy in a sea of loss. In this world, monasteries still exist, still pray, still copy texts, but they are not the only lights in the dark because the dark never fully arrives. The church too changes under this pressure of continuity. It cannot become the sole transnational structure standing above kings if those kings do not replace emperors. Instead, bishops become more openly what they often were in practice: urban administrators, moral authorities, and negotiators. Yet they operate within a state that is capable of asserting itself, and this creates a tension that is different from our history. The empire learns that spiritual legitimacy is useful, but it also learns that allowing any institution to rival the state's organizational reach is dangerous. So it cultivates a partnership that is conditional. The church blesses order. The state protects the church. Neither is allowed to swallow the other. People in the streets do not phrase it that way. They feel it in the rhythm of life, in the way disputes are settled, in the way festivals are policed, in the way sermons occasionally hint at imperial policy and imperial proclamations occasionally quote scripture. The empire is not gentle, but it is coherent, and coherence is a kind of mercy compared to chaos. Then the next great pressure arrives from the south and east, where in our world a new religious and political force would explode outward across the deserts and seas. In this timeline, the Roman Mediterranean is more tightly held, its fleets more vigilant, its fortresses better supplied, and its eastern frontier more coordinated between Constantinople and the western capitals, and that changes the early calculus of expansion. The rise of a new power in Arabia still happens, because Rome cannot control the birth of ideas, but the pathway into a fractured Near East is narrower. Border provinces are not as exhausted by internal imperial civil war, and the empire's intelligence networks, those quiet chains of informants, traitors, and officials, have not been severed. As a result, The initial clashes are more evenly matched, and the conflict becomes less a sudden avalanche and more a drawn-out contest of endurance. Cities like Alexandria and Antioch are not simply left to fend for themselves amid imperial confusion. They become fortified priorities, and while the empire may still lose territory in the first waves, as empires often do when surprised, it regains others through counter-campaigns that are possible only because its fiscal base and logistical systems have been preserved. The Mediterranean becomes an even sharper fault line between worlds, not a sea that changes hands quickly, but a contested arena where Roman ports and rival ports glare at each other across the water, where captives are traded, where treaties are signed and broken, where spies carry coded letters under their tunics, and where ordinary people live with the constant hum of distant war. You can hear it in the marketplaces. An old sailor swears the horizon has changed. A mother bargains harder because she doesn't trust tomorrow's prices. A priest preaches patience, and a magistrate posts a new edict about grain storage. The empire, under that pressure, evolves again. It becomes more maritime, more professional, more centralized in military matters, and more experimental in governance because survival against a peer competitor forces innovation. And innovation has consequences that ripple into the long future. When political fragmentation is reduced, certain kinds of competition decline. There are fewer small states racing each other in desperate bursts, but other competitions intensify within the imperial system. Cities compete for imperial favor, provinces compete for funding, generals compete for command, scholars compete for influence. The empire channels ambition inward, like a river forced into engineered canals, and those canals can carry great cargo or they can flood disastrously if mismanaged. The question that haunted Rome in every century becomes even more urgent in this enduring timeline. Can a state this large remain flexible without breaking apart? The answer in this world is yes, barely, continuously, through constant adaptation that becomes a cultural habit. Instead of a clean fall, the Roman story becomes a long series of reforms punctuated by crises, each crisis generating a new layer of institutional skin. Over centuries, the emperor's role shifts further from heroic conqueror to chief executive of a vast machine, and that machine requires paperwork the way a body requires blood. Bureaucracy, often mocked, becomes civilization's skeleton. The empire invests in standardized measures, standardized legal training, standardized coinage practices, and systems of audit that reduce but never eliminate corruption. Education becomes less a luxury of elites and more a practical pipeline for administrators, scribes, engineers, and officers. Not everyone is literate, but literacy is widespread enough that propaganda and law can be broadcast more effectively, that dissent can circulate faster too, and that both government and opposition learn to speak to a semi-informed public rather than a silent peasantry. Public works regain their centrality not as vanity, but as control. Aqueducts and roads are political statements, and their maintenance buys legitimacy. In this alternate Europe, you still get plagues because microbes don't care about empires, and when plague hits, it hits hard. You still get famines because weather remains merciless. You still get rebellions because human beings resist being managed. But the empire's continuity changes the response. Quarantine measures appear earlier and more systematically because there is a functioning state that can enforce them. Relief shipments are organized because there are warehouses and fleets. Rebuilding happens faster because tax systems can be temporarily redirected. This doesn't make the empire kind, but it makes it resilient. Over time, Rome's long wariness of concentrated private power leads to a different economic evolution. Merchant guilds exist, but they operate under imperial charters that limit their autonomy. Large banking networks emerge earlier in the Mediterranean world because long-distance trade is steady and legally protected. Insurance becomes more formal because maritime commerce is constant and risky. And technology spreads with fewer interruptions because roads and ports continue to connect regions. You see the difference in small details that accumulate into worlds. Glass remains a common product rather than a rare treasure. Engineering knowledge is transmitted continuously. Urban sanitation, while imperfect, is treated as an administrative responsibility rather than an afterthought. And artisans think in terms of imperial markets rather than local fairs. The North and West, Regions that, in our history, became separate cultural realms after Rome's retreat, remain tied to the imperial orbit through a combination of military presence, trade incentives, and cultural assimilation. Germanic peoples are not erased. They are incorporated, which changes their identity over generations, producing a Romanized frontier aristocracy that speaks Latin, serves in the army, and sees itself as imperial even as it preserves certain local customs. The idea of barbarian kingdoms that replace Rome never fully solidifies. Instead, you get provincial power blocks within the imperial structure, always threatening to become independent, always pulled back by a mixture of patronage and force. This is not a utopia. It is a different kind of struggle, one where the empire's problems become chronic rather than terminal. As centuries turn, the capital's symbolism shifts. Old Rome remains sacred, an anchor of legitimacy, a city of monuments and memory, but administrative gravity continues to favor the East, where wealth and population are denser, where the imperial court has more control, and where the geopolitics are sharper. Rather than a single capital, the empire becomes a network of capitals, administrative hubs that rise and fall in importance depending on threats and trade, each with palaces, arsenals, archives, and bureaucrats whose quiet decisions shape millions of lives. When northern frontiers flare, a western capital becomes the nerve center. When eastern borders erupt, Constantinople tightens its grip. When the sea becomes contested, a naval city becomes the empire's beating heart. The empire learns to be polycentric without splitting, like a body that can move blood to different limbs as needed. That adaptability also changes the arc of exploration. In our timeline, the Atlantic became a stage for new powers after Mediterranean dominance weakened and rival states competed fiercely. In this timeline, the empire's gaze eventually turns outward, not because it is desperate for alternative routes, but because stable maritime capacity and accumulated administrative confidence make long voyages feasible investments. Exploration becomes an imperial project, slow, methodical, regulated, rather than a chaotic race between small kingdoms. Roman ships push beyond familiar coasts with official backing, mapped by imperial surveyors, provisioned by state contracts, their crews disciplined by naval law. This does not guarantee moral restraint, it guarantees organization. An organization makes conquest more effective. When contact with distant lands expands, it is filtered through imperial institutions, which means exploitation can be systematized, but it also means certain extremes can be moderated by regulation if the center chooses. The center does not always choose well. In the empire's own propaganda, expansion is described as order spreading into disorder, law into lawlessness, civilization into chaos. In the letters of sailors and merchants, it is described in simpler terms: profit, fear, wonder, homesickness. At home, ordinary people experience these global shifts not through maps, but through objects, unfamiliar spices, strange fabrics, new coins stamped with symbols that imply the world is wider than any one person's life. With the empire's continuity, the scientific and technical tradition also follows a different path. Without the prolonged fragmentation of institutions, certain kinds of knowledge remain cumulative. Engineering stays prestigious because the state needs engineers. Medicine evolves within a network of urban centers that share practices. Astronomy and mathematics remain tied to navigation and calendar governance. And legal theory grows denser because law remains a living system rather than a relic. Yet continuity can also calcify. The empire's bureaucratic confidence can become arrogance. Its legalism can become rigidity. Internal debates rage in schools and courts about the balance between tradition and innovation, about whether the old forms are sacred or merely useful. And sometimes, in a hallway outside a tribunal, you can feel the empire's age in the exhaustion of an official who has spent his entire life copying rules that were written before his grandfather was born. The empire survives by reforming, but reform is never painless. Every reform creates losers, and losers make trouble. So the empire's story becomes one of controlled turbulence. Revolts flare in distant provinces when taxes spike. Religious movements erupt when the state appears to meddle too much in belief. Regional commanders push boundaries when they feel ignored. And from time to time, a crisis emerges that looks for a moment like the long-delayed end. Each time the empire responds with a familiar toolkit: negotiation, co-option, selective violence, administrative restructuring, symbolic gestures, and relentless messaging that insists continuity is destiny. People live inside that messaging like fish live inside water. They complain, they joke, they fear, they hope, but they rarely imagine a world without the empire because the empire is the world's background noise. What does that do to identity? It creates a different sense of belonging, not primarily to a nation-state, not primarily to a local lord, but to a vast civic structure that is imperfect yet persistent. In this timeline, Roman becomes less an ethnicity and more a legal cultural category spread across continents, a shared civic skin that can contain many languages and customs as long as they pay taxes, obey laws, and serve when called. Over the very long term, that category evolves, blending with regional identities rather than erasing them. The empire becomes a federation in practice even when it calls itself an empire, because governing diversity at scale forces compromises, and compromises become tradition. Eventually, pressures that in our world produced modern revolutions, demands for representation, frustration with inequality, the spread of pamphlets and public debate, also emerge here, but they emerge under an imperial frame. Movements don't aim to replace a king with a republic. They aim to force the empire to redefine what citizenship means. Who holds power? How provinces are represented? How the military is controlled? The empire faces a choice it has faced in different forms since the days of the Republic: reform from within or be torn apart by those who reform through fire. It survives by doing what it did at its best in the ancient past, by turning pressure into law. Assemblies gain new relevance. Provincial councils gain formal roles. The emperor's authority is constrained by procedures that are presented as restorations, even when they are innovations, because Rome's greatest propaganda trick is to label the new as the old reborn. This changes the shape of modernity. The concept of the sovereign nation-state emerges more slowly, or in different forms because one megastate already exists. Ideological battles play out as conflicts over imperial policy, rather than wars between dozens of rival crowns. That does not eliminate war, it changes its topology. External wars become frontier wars against peer powers and coalitions. Internal wars become political convulsions inside the imperial structure, conflicts over autonomy and rights, clashes between central authority and regional identity. You can imagine news sheets sold in crowded plazas, printed now, not handwritten, announcing debates in the imperial councils, reporting on disturbances in distant provinces, describing naval standoffs in contested seas, and always reminding readers that the empire endures. And still, the empire carries its oldest contradiction. It claims universal order, yet it relies on force. It celebrates law, yet it bends law to survive. It calls itself eternal, yet it is made of mortal people who must choose again and again not to let it die. So what does the world look like when Rome never falls? It looks more connected across the old Mediterranean basin, more administratively consistent across Europe, and less defined by the sharp cultural rupture that in our timeline separated ancient from medieval. It looks like cities that never completely emptied, like roads that never fully vanished into weeds, like a legal tradition that never had to be rediscovered because it never stopped being used. It looks like a Christianity that never becomes the single organizing spine of the West because the state remains strong, and like a Roman identity that spreads and mutates over time rather than collapsing into memory. It looks like an imperial contest with rival civilizations that becomes a long chess game across deserts, mountains, and seas instead of a rapid replacement of one empire by another. It looks like exploration and expansion carried out by a centralized machine rather than a swarm of competing small powers, which can mean fewer chaotic wars between European states overseas, but also more efficient and far-reaching imperial control when Rome decides it wants something. And it looks like the everyday life of ordinary people shaped by the same presence their ancestors knew: the tax collector, the magistrate, the soldier on the road, the official seal on a document, the public announcement nailed in a forum, The quiet confidence that, whatever storms come, there is still a system holding the world together. But there is one final domino that matters most, the one that gives this timeline its hard, logical ending. Because the empire never falls, it never becomes a cautionary tale to later powers. It becomes the model, the standard, the gravitational center that other societies either imitate or resist. For 2,000 years, the Roman state learns, adapts, and survives. And in doing so, it teaches humanity a lesson that is both inspiring and unsettling. Civilizations do not die only because enemies breach their walls. They die when they can no longer reorganize themselves faster than the world changes. In our world, Rome failed that test. In this world, it passes over and over until endurance itself becomes its identity, until Rome is no longer a city or a set of legions but a living argument written across continents. That order can outlast chaos if it is willing to transform without admitting it has changed. And in the last frames of this documentary world, you can almost hear the echo of marching feet, not as a triumphant end, but as a steady rhythm that refuses to stop. A reminder that the most dramatic alternative history is not a new empire rising from ashes, but the old one simply deciding, at the brink, that it will not become ashes at all.